London, 1919. The city is still covered in the grey ash of war. In the heart of this city, Virginia Woolf creates a novel. It is called Night and Day. This story walks the thin line between night and day, dreams and reality, and logic and emotion. On the surface, it looks like a simple comedy about marriage from the old Victorian era. But inside, the seeds of modernism are quietly and firmly taking root. Imagine Catherine Hilbery in her study. The room is filled with books and maps of the stars. She looks out the window and thinks to herself. Math formulas give her answers. But what about love? What about life? To her, these things are like the stars in the night sky. You can read them, but you can never fully translate their language. Then, Ralph Denham knocks on the door. He asks her if she is an astronomer calculating the stars, or a poet wondering about love under those same stars. Catherine smiles. She tells him she might be both. She sees Ralph the same way. He is a lawyer who uses logic in court, but he is also a dreamer and an idealist. Now we move to the office of Mary Datchet. The walls are covered in posters for women's right to vote and piles of books. Mary is giving a speech with great passion. She tells the crowd that they are not just asking for the right to vote. They are asking for the right to define their own lives. She believes marriage should be a choice, not the only destiny for a woman. Catherine is in the audience, listening with bated breath. Mary is like a mirror for Catherine. She represents another version of herself, torn between the duties society expects and her own personal desires. Here, Woolf flips the traditional story of marriage on its head. Marriage is not a magical rescue. Instead, it is a compromise, or perhaps just a promise of a new beginning. The story echoes the play As You Like It by William Shakespeare. In the play, characters go to the forest to find their true selves. But Woolf replaces the forest with the busy streets of London. Catherine and Ralph do not find themselves in the woods. Instead, they find each other in libraries and along the riverbanks. They wander through the boundary of dreams and reality. The free spirit of Shakespeare is reborn in the middle of a modern city. Catherine stands alone in front of the Elgin marbles. The cold white stone of the sculptures meets the warm gold of the setting sun. She whispers that these stones hold dreams from thousands of years ago. Yet, she feels she cannot even understand the reality of today. In this moment, Catherine is more than just a visitor. She faces the art of the past in the depths of her own mind. She asks herself, who am I? This is where the stream of consciousness begins to breathe. It is the technique where a writer follows the natural flow of a character's thoughts, and Woolf starts experimenting with it right here. If we look at the writer's desk, we see the original manuscript. The title written on the page is Dreams and Realities. This duality is the secret code of Woolf's writing. During the violence of the war, she stepped back into the safe world of the past to write this book. But this was not a retreat. It was a strategic breath before leaping into modernism. Her husband, Leonard Woolf, called this novel a planned exercise in strict form and classic style. Virginia agreed. But we now know the truth. Under that classic surface, the waves of consciousness were already crashing. These waves would eventually lead to her great works, Mrs. Dalloway and to The Lighthouse. As the sun sets and stars appear over the Thames River, Ralph takes Catherine's hand. He tells her that she loved the night and he believed in the day. But now he sees that they both live on the border between the two. Catherine asks if they should walk together, so that both the night and the day can belong to them. The story ends with a marriage. But this ending is not a return to old traditions. It is a symbol of a door opening to new possibilities. Virginia Woolf stood on the threshold of modernism. She left the Victorian living room to sail the deep river of human consciousness. That first step is the most beautiful legacy of Night and Day. The screen fades to black with a quote from As You Like It. Sweet are the uses of adversity, which, like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head. This novel was the second one Woolf wrote and the first published by the Hogarth Press, which she started with Leonard in 1917. The very first thing the press published was a pamphlet called Two Stories. It included a piece by Virginia called The Mark on the Wall. She wrote it all in a flash, as if she were flying. This was the moment her mature, modern voice truly arrived. Woolf also based the character of Catherine on her sister, Vanessa Bell. She even used the Greek spelling of Catherine to match Vanessa's artistic nature. She told a friend to think of Catherine as Vanessa, not as herself. This shows that while the story was deeply personal and rooted in her family life, she wanted to move away from a simple autobiography. Even though Night and Day follows the older style of realistic storytelling, it was the bridge to everything that came after. When we look at the reception of Night and Day, we see a real divide. Some critics loved it. They called it fresh, new, and exquisite. They even compared it to the classic style of Jane Austen. But others were not so kind. Catherine Mansfield, for example, felt the book was too serene. She thought it felt like it was written before the war, as if it had no scars from the trauma of World War I. Virginia Woolf felt the sting of these negative reviews, though she brushed them off as personal spite. For Woolf, this novel was a bit of a contradiction. On one hand, Night and Day was a retreat. It was like stepping back into the secure, lost world of her childhood. She modeled the Allardyce and Hilbery household after her own family and figures like Annie Thackeray Ritchie. But at the same time, Woolf was starting to crave something different. She was beginning to experiment with her short stories, dreaming of a kind of narrative freedom. She wanted a style with no plot and little probability, almost like a vague, general confusion. This push for independence became physical when the Woolfs installed their own hand-printing press. We can also see feminist and personal layers hidden in the characters. Take the heroine, Catherine Hilbery. Woolf intentionally gave her a dislike for books, poetry, and fiction. It was a way to keep the character separate from herself. Then there is Mary Datchet. Mary reflects Woolf's admiration for social reformers, like her cousin Margaret Llewellyn Davies, who left her family duties behind to fight for social change. Even Ralph Denham has echoes of Leonard Woolf, though Virginia left out certain details, like his Jewish identity, perhaps because of the social sensitivities of the time. Today, Night and Day and The Story Flush are some of Woolf's most neglected works. They might have been popular at first, and there was even interest in turning them into films, but they are not as famous now. This is likely because they do not seem as radical as her later masterpieces like Mrs. Dalloway or To the Lighthouse. Still, we can see the seeds of those later works here. For instance, the image of a lighthouse first appears in Night and Day, with birds dashing against the glass, long before it became the center of her later famous novel. Even though Night and Day follows a more traditional path than her later books, it already shows the beginnings of her modern style. We see it in the interior monologues and deep philosophical reflections. For example, Lady Otway gives a warning about marriage and the need for autonomy. We also see symbolic imagery, like the dome of the British Museum, which represents the heavy structure of a male-dominated society. Eventually, Woolf grew tired of these conventions. She found the plot wearisome. By the time she wrote Jacob's Room in 1922, she rejected that old scaffolding entirely. She embraced a style that was fragmented and focused on the raw, subjective experience of the individual. Woolf's growth was also fueled by the art around her. Her engagement with Roger Fry's vision and design in 1920 showed her blending post-impressionist art into her writing. She began to see form, rhythm, and visual composition as the keys to innovating a story. When she wrote reviews for the Women's Leader, she used her authority as a critic to push these avant-garde ideas forward using clear and persuasive language. Behind this creative growth was a quiet, personal struggle. Between 1913 and 1915, Woolf suffered a severe mental collapse. She described it as a real nightmare. This happened right after her marriage and just before she wrote Night and Day. The fact that she finished such a complex and socially detailed novel while recovering shows her incredible discipline and tenacity. To understand her journey, we can look at a few key markers. The Mark on the Wall was a foundational piece of modernist writing. It was meditative and rejected realism, paving the way for Mrs. Dalloway. Then there was Two Stories in 1917, the first release from the Hogarth Press. This was the birth of an independent, artist-run venture that resisted the gatekeepers of the commercial and patriarchal world. If we look at the critical heritage, we see how polarized the early reviews were. Some praised her for being adventurous, while others dismissed her work as pretentious or storyless. Finally, the Berg collection manuscripts show us the messy reality of her process. One manuscript begins in the middle of the novel, which suggests that Woolf was constantly revising and shifting her composition as she went. Virginia Woolf's later works, like The Years and Three Guineas, grew from the seeds planted in her earlier writing. She became deeply concerned with gender, the way people live in public, and how history actually changes. But some critics felt a strange gap in her novel Night and Day. They felt its old-fashioned charm and poise were out of step with the world after the war. One reviewer even said the message of the book was that the war never happened. This feeling that she was avoiding reality troubled many people. Night and Day acted as both a safe harbor and a cage for Woolf. It was a necessary step backward that eventually allowed her to take giant leaps forward. This leads us to a bigger shift in storytelling. Literature moved away from Victorian realism towards something more experimental. In the 19th century, novels often felt artificial because they wrapped everything up in neat little bows. Postmodern writers hated this. They did not want a tidy ending. Instead, they wanted to show the seams of the story. They embraced the idea that things are often unclear. Take Angela Carter and her book Nights at the Circus. She starts with the old myth of Leda and the Swan, a story about a violent encounter with a god. But Carter flips the script. Her main character is not a passive victim. She is a person with her own power. This is a feminist way of taking back old myths. Then we have Kazuo Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day. This story uses a narrator who holds everything back. Stevens the butler represents a British ideal of dignity, but that dignity is actually a form of denial. It is tied to the decline of an empire. Some see this as a critique of conservatism disguised as nostalgia, reflecting the tension of the Suez Crisis era. Salman Rushdie takes a different path in Midnight's Children. He looks to non-Western traditions, like the endless tales of Scheherazade, to fight against colonial ways of storytelling. He uses magical realism not to escape the world, but as a political tool. It allows people who have been pushed to the margins to tell their own stories in their own way. Modernism started the process of breaking linear time and objective truth through writers like Woolf, Joyce, and Faulkner. Postmodernism took that impulse and pushed it to the limit. Influenced by Kafka, Beckett, and the French Nouveau Roman, the novel became self-aware and often absurd. It became a mirror for a world scarred by Auschwitz, Hiroshima, and the uncertainty of quantum physics. There was a generational shift. Readers in the late 20th century grew up with existential doubt and a constant flood of media. They stopped believing in happy, tidy endings. They preferred the messiness and the irony of life. As one voice put it, this is an era of uncertainty, and that is exactly how they like it. Even with all this rebellion, postmodern fiction does not abandon reality. It actually makes reality feel more intense. By using magical realism or stories that know they are stories, authors create a new kind of moral urgency. These techniques are the new revelations for a modern world. This is a journey of narrative liberation. It is about moving from being a character in someone else's story, whether that story was colonial or patriarchal, to becoming the author of your own. It is a move from hiding the construction of a story to flaunting it. It is literature responding to the trauma of war, empire, and genocide by breaking the form of the book itself. It is about rewriting myths to empower the silenced and accepting that time is not a straight line, but a collection of memories and fantasies. This segment dives into how the stories we tell, and the way we tell them, have shifted right alongside the massive changes shaking up the modern world. First, think about the cities in your favorite books. Are they just a background, a place where characters meet and talk? For modernist and postmodern writers, the answer was no. The city itself became a character. The corner stores, the rivers cutting through downtown, the bridges connecting different neighborhoods, all of it was alive, changing, shaping the people who lived there just as much as they shaped it. This reflected a bigger obsession writers had with city life, the way it can make you feel totally alone even when you're surrounded by thousands of people, the way it can warp your sense of who you are, the constant rush of change that leaves you grasping for stability. That ties directly to the widespread critique of modern civilization popping up across European literature at the time. So many people felt displaced, anonymous, like none of the old rules or meanings mattered anymore. Writers responded by turning inward, focusing on their characters' inner thoughts and private feelings instead of just their public actions. It was a way to make sense of a world that felt increasingly empty and directionless. A perfect example of this new narrative style is Kazuo Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day. The book's narrator, Stevens, often talks like he and the reader share the same background knowledge. He'll name-drop figures like George Bernard Shaw without explaining who they are, assuming you already get the reference. But that creates a quiet gap between what Stevens means to say and what we actually understand. That gap is a hallmark of modern storytelling. Writers stopped holding the reader's hand, spelling everything out clearly, to make the experience feel more true to the confusing, unspoken parts of real life. Two major thinkers, Frederick Jameson and David Miller, argued that novels serve a specific social purpose in Western societies. They act like a kind of regulatory social presence, a space where we work through collective problems and test out different ideas about how to live together. But both thinkers noted that a lot of theories about the novel miss a key point: stories don't exist in a vacuum. They're written by real people living through real, concrete historical moments, dealing with tangible problems like poverty, war, and inequality. You can't separate a novel from the world that produced it. Another key distinction thinkers like Oswald Spengler and Northrop Frye drew between novels and older story forms comes down to time versus values. Older epics and myths were built around fixed, unchanging values: honor, loyalty, duty, ideals that stay the same no matter what era you live in. Novels, by contrast, are built around life by time. They follow characters as they age, as the world shifts around them, as choices they made decades earlier ripple forward to shape their present. It's less about perfect, timeless ideals and more about the messy, uneven experience of living through time, of growing and changing as the world changes too. Post-colonial writers flipped old colonial stories on their head to push back against that legacy. Take Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, a classic colonial text where a European man travels deep into Africa, a place colonial writers framed as dark and uncivilized, and loses his grip on morality. Taib Salih's Season of Migration to the North turns that story completely upside down. Salih's protagonist is a Sudanese man who travels north, into the heart of the European imperial centers that colonized his home. He's the one confronting the colonizers, not the other way around. This reversal captures the messy, hybrid reality of cultural collision. Colonizer and colonized shaped each other for centuries, and that tangled history can't be undone by simple old power dynamics. There's also the figure of Maximus, pulled from Charles Olsen's Maximus poem set in the town of Gloucester. Picture a poet wandering the streets of his hometown, torn between two powerful poles, a deep, almost spiritual love for the town's history and community, and burning rage at how commercial development is erasing all of that. Generic chain stores replace local family shops, ugly new buildings cover the old waterfront, the tight-knit community he grew up with scatters as people can't afford to live there anymore. That split feeling, between reverence for the past and fury at the way the present is destroying it, embodies the fractured relationship many artists had with the rapid, unregulated changes of modernity. For a long time, 19th-century realist novels stuck as close to everyday life as possible, leaving no room for magic or the fantastical. That changed with magical realism, a style where impossible, extraordinary events happen, but the characters treat them as totally normal. This wasn't just a quirky writing choice. It came from new ways of understanding the world, especially in formerly colonized countries. For writers who lived through colonial exploitation, arbitrary borders drawn by foreign powers, and the erasure of their cultures, plain realism felt like it could never capture how absurd and unjust their actual lives were. Magical realism let them show that hidden truth. Postmodernism, by contrast, looked back to those early 20th century breaks with traditional storytelling, playing with structure and form in similar ways to the modernists who came before them. One of the oldest archetypes of survival through storytelling is Scheherazade, the legendary narrator of 1001 Nights, who told the king a new story every night to delay her execution. Modern writer Salman Rushdie is a direct heir to that legacy. His novel 2 Years 8 Months and 28 Nights is named for the exact length of Scheherazade's storytelling marathon, and it frames storytelling itself as an act of resistance against violent fundamentalism. Just like Scheherazade used stories to save her own life, Rushdie uses his writing to push back against forces that want to silence marginalized voices and erase diverse ways of seeing the world. Modernist writers also rebelled against the strict, orderly chapter structures of Victorian novels. Writers like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and William Faulkner rejected the idea that chapters should be neat, self-contained chunks that move the plot forward in a straight line. Instead, they fragmented chapters, hopped between different timelines and perspectives, broke all the old rules of structure. Their goal was to make their stories mirror the disjointed, jumping around nature of actual human thought. Your own memories don't come in neat, ordered chapters, right? They jump from a random childhood moment to a worry about next week, to a song you heard on the radio this morning. These writers wanted their books to feel that same messy, authentic human experience. Even the most original, groundbreaking poets are shaped by the writers who came before them. Dante's work casts a shadow over every poet who wrote after him, just as John Milton's poetry influenced the way William Wordsworth crafted his own work. Think of it like cooking. Even if you invent a totally new recipe, you're still using techniques and ingredients you learned from other cooks, building on the work of people who came before you. Thinker Giambattista Vico laid out a cyclical theory of history, where societies move through distinct phases, first a theocratic age ruled by religious authority, then an aristocratic age ruled by small groups of elites, then a democratic age ruled by the broader population, before the cycle starts again. Many 20th century thinkers believed Western culture was on the brink of a new, chaotic phase of that cycle, which helps explain why so much art and literature from that era felt so experimental, so unmoored from old rules and traditions. All of these threads tie back to the core question driving this segment: how have the forms our stories take, from the realist novel to magical realism to post-colonial fiction, shifted to respond to the changing world around us? End. Stories have never just been entertainment. For as long as people have told them, they've been tools for survival, for invention, for pushing back against even the darkest, most hopeless moments. Think of Scheherazade, the woman from the classic collection 1001 Nights. Night after night, she told the king's stories to delay her own execution. That's the core metaphor here. Storytelling isn't just passing time. It's a way to stay alive, to resist, even when you're stuck in what feels like the darkest valley imaginable. This idea sits at the heart of a larger look at how trauma, city change, and the search for meaning in modern life all tie back to the stories we tell. To break that down, let's start with how novels have always worked. Writer Orhan Pamuk points out that every novel balances two kinds of storytelling, the kind that moves forward in a straight, steady line, and the kind that jumps around, stitches together random fragments, feels messy and disjointed. Even if you grabbed a stuffy, rule-obsessed Victorian writer who thought novels had to follow strict, proper structures, and dropped them in the middle of a 21st century bookstore, they could still pick up a modern novel and follow it. The core of how we expect stories to flow hasn't changed as much as we think. That control over how storytime works goes way back. Take Homer's Iliad, specifically the scene in Book 3 where Helen and Paris meet. A lot of old literary critics used to say ancient poems were just patchworks, thrown together randomly by different poets over time, like a kid gluing random craft scraps to a poster board. But that's not true. Those early poets had tight, deliberate control over how much time passed in their stories. When you watch a movie, you don't film every single second of a character's date. You cut to the meaningful moments, the lines that matter, the glances that say more than words. Those ancient poets did the exact same thing. The question with Helen and Paris's meeting is simple: how much of the actual day passes in that scene? Does their encounter happen at a normal, expected time, like the afternoon slot when everyone would be out and about? The poet chose exactly how much time to show, to make that moment land exactly right. That balance of old and new, of tight structure and experimental form, is where Thomas Mann comes in. He's one of the most important figures in the history of the novel, standing right between the old guard of realistic writers like Tolstoy, who wrote sprawling, detailed stories that felt like real life, and the new modernists like James Joyce and Marcel Proust, who messed with time, hopped inside characters' heads, and broke all the old rules. Mann's use of historical subject matter lines up directly with another book, D.M. Thomas's The White Hotel. That novel blends real, brutal historical trauma, specifically the horrors of the Holocaust, with Sigmund Freud's ideas about how the human mind works, plus outright fantasy. It's like mixing a history textbook, a psychology lecture, and a fairy tale all together to explore how extreme violence sticks with people, haunts them, shapes who they become. Most of this segment, though, focuses on Virginia Woolf's novel The Voyage Out, and its main character Catherine Hilbery. The scene opens on a quiet, ordinary Sunday evening, the kind where family and friends gather for tea. It's a cozy, familiar setting, the kind you'd see in any upper-class home of the time. But inside Catherine's head, everything is far more complicated. She's navigating conversations with her mother, with potential suitors like Ralph Denham and William Rodney, all while fighting the urge to just walk away. She looks at people like Mary Datchet and Mr. Denham, who live simple, uncomplicated lives, free of the heavy family expectations and social rules that trap her. She envies that simplicity, that freedom, even as she feels like she can never have it for herself. Every moment is a tug-of-war between the polite, proper face she has to show the world, and the private, often sarcastic, exhausted thoughts running through her head. It's that feeling you get at a boring family gathering, nodding along to a story you've heard 100 times under the bright daylight of social expectation, while your brain is already planning how to sneak out into the dark and do something that actually matters to you. That split between the person you have to be during the day, and the person you are when no one's watching, is the quiet heartbeat of this whole story, fitting perfectly with the day and night theme. The fragment shifts next to a tense domestic scene between Catherine and her mother, Mrs. Hilbery. Mrs. Hilbery is emotional, rambling, lost in nostalgic stories about marriage and family history, completely out of step with the boring, practical realities of running a household, like unpaid water bills or a cook who suddenly quit. Catherine is stuck right in the middle. On one side is her mother's messy, idealized, out-of-touch world, full of old family drama and unspoken expectations. On the other is the simpler, grittier, more authentic life she sees in people like Mary and Mr. Denham, a life she craves but feels like she can't access because of her last name and her family's reputation. Another character, Joan, is held up as a contrast to Catherine. Even though Joan has a lower social standing, she's described as having far more vitality, more life and energy than Catherine, who feels drained by all the weight of her inheritance. This is the core tension of the section, the heavy, suffocating burden of family legacy and social expectation, versus the desire to build an independent life, on your own terms, no strings attached. All of these threads tie back to the big questions the work is exploring. Time, and how it stretches and shrinks depending on what we're feeling. Narrative structure, and how the way a story is put together changes what it means to the person hearing it. Historical consciousness, how both big world events and small family histories hang over the present, shaping the choices we make. Emotional repression, especially for women who were taught to hide their true feelings to fit into rigid social roles. And social expectation, the unspoken rules that tell us who we should be, who we should love, what our lives are supposed to look like. The segment closes on Catherine lying awake in the dark, turning all these tensions over in her mind, looking at her relationships with a mix of cool detachment and wry, tired humor, no clear answers in sight. Catherine thinks about her place in the world. She is the granddaughter of a man who kept a shop, a legacy that connects her to the Pargeter and Hilbery families. But when she looks at Joan, she sees a sharp contrast. Catherine has social status, but that status comes with a price. She is dependent on others. She watches people like Mary Datchet and Mr. Denham and feels a pang of jealousy. To her, their lives seem so much simpler. She wonders how easy it must be to live like they do, free from the messy emotional webs that tangle everything up in her own home. Then there is the feeling that she is not actually an adult. In one moment, Catherine realizes she does not feel like a grown woman. She does not feel capable of giving advice or taking charge. Instead, she feels tiny. It is as if she is only a foot or two taller than the long grass, clinging to someone else for stability. This person might be her mother or another authority figure. It shows how fragile her identity is. Even though she is an adult, she feels small and powerless within the walls of her own house. The story also shows a big gap between high society dreams and the gritty reality of daily life. Mrs. Hilbery spends her time worrying about abstract things. She frets over bad friends, the mysteries of love, and how to give marriage advice. But while she is dreaming, the real world is crashing in. The water rates are overdue. The cook has quit in a temper, storming out without even waiting for her final paycheck. Mrs. Hilbery tries to fix these problems by thinking of a widow of a general or calling for help. She is disconnected. She wants to maintain a certain social image, but the household is struggling financially. Meanwhile, there is Joan. Joan earns her own living. Because she works and struggles, she has a quality and a vitality that Catherine simply does not have. It suggests that facing hard times is what actually makes a person strong. The scene begins with a heavy warning about marriage. A voice tells Catherine that when she marries, she must be absolutely sure that she loves her husband. For the older generation, marriage is a dangerous game. They see it as something easily ruined by bad friends or mischief. The younger generation, however, is just trying to find their own way. They often feel like the people around them do not truly understand them. When we put it all together, we see a picture of friction between generations. Mrs. Hilbery represents the past. She is emotional and relies on who she knows, often ignoring the dirty details of how to survive. Catherine is caught in the middle. She has a spark of life in her, but she feels trapped by her role. She envies the simple life of the working class, like Joan, and the independence of people like Mary and Mr. Denham. Yet, she is tied down by her family name and her mother's emotional demands. In the end, this is a study of how the mind works and how time feels. Catherine is analyzing her life from the inside. She realizes that her calm exterior is just a mask for her dependency. She begins to see that true strength and vitality might actually be found in the very struggles she has been trying to avoid. The way the story is told in fragments mirrors her own thoughts. It reflects the broken nature of memory and the disjointed way people actually talk and think.